Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alastair.
And I'm Nick.
And this week we'll be discussing The Hanging Tree, Ben Aaronovitch's latest Peter Grant novel, and The Grand Tour, the new outing from Clarkson, Hammond and May. We'll also be checking back in with Class to find out how the Doctor Who spin-off ended, and finding out what Nick thought about Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. But before all of that, Nick, what have you been up to over the last 2 weeks?
Since last episode, I've been to Smash, a series of panels about comics hosted by the London Graphic Novel Network, which took place at the Barbican on Saturday 26th November. It seems to be an annual event. I certainly went to it in 2015 as well, at around the same time of year. And it features, I think it was the same last year, 3 panels made up of 4 comics creators talking about various aspects of comics. I think the 3 panels this year were genre, future and taste, which were quite broad, but, had a lot of scope for the panellists to talk. Panellists included Cy Spurrier, who wrote Cry Havoc, which we discussed a few episodes back. It's a great comic, and he was on the genre panel, which is fair enough, as he does like to bend his genres. And also Dave McKean, famously the cover artist of Sandman, and various other creators, including Amber Sue, Sarah Kenny, Julia Shield, Paul Gravitz. But yeah, it's interesting series of conversations. They usually put the panels up on their website in sort of video or audio, I think video last year, form, and they're usually worth watching if you're interested in reasonably intelligent and sometimes funny discussions about comics. Yeah, it's one of the better comic events I've been to. It's hosted by Joel Jadurek, who also runs the London Graphic Novel Network as a whole, which is a sort of mailing list where people pick a comic every 3 weeks, then have a sort of reasonably in-depth discussion about it. Well, how in-depth, depending on how much people have to say about it, I guess. But yeah, the London Graphic Novel Network, if you want a sort of ongoing discussion about comics in your inbox, and I guess if you live in London, although I don't really think it's actually mandatory, it doesn't really come up in the comics. It's worth joining. It's at londongraphicnovelnetwork.com, and Joel, along with all the other panellists from the event, Marzin Salim, is also the 2 of the co-hosts of the Kraken podcast, which, if you like podcasts where groups of men talk about their current issues, and, again, why wouldn't you? That's one of the better ones I listen to, I think. It's a podcast I do genuinely look forward to every week, and I suspect they may well hate this level of sort of straight-on sincerity, but never mind. If you like podcasts and you're not listening to Kraken already, then I firmly recommend giving it at least 1 or 2 episodes. It's fun.
Yeah, I would second that. Kraken is a very good podcast. Yeah, it's a really good kind of discussion of. They cover basically like politics and pop culture mainly, and they go into a lot of detail on both. And yeah, they usually have a lot of really interesting things to say.
And yes, I should probably stress, it's unlike this podcast. It's not just the in-depth over-analysis of pop culture. There's a lot of talk about broader politics and culture stuff as well, which is one of the reasons it's so good. So, yep, that's been me. Alastair, what have you been up to?
I went to the BFI's Black Star season. So the BFI currently have a season that's celebrating African Americans in cinema. They're showing like a huge range of films, incorporating things such as the original Blade, starring Wesley Snipes. They're showing Spike Lee's Malcolm X biopic. They're showing like a huge range of different films. There was a lot of stuff to see, but I went to see 2 films. First of all, In the Heat of the Night, which I highly recommended. It's a really good crime thriller. It seems quite old-fashioned by today's standards in that it sort of moves quite slowly relative to the breakneck pace of film that we're kind of used to in the 21st century. But it's really, really good, engaging film about racism in the Deep South and sort of police investigating a murder. It stars Sidney Poitier, who won an Oscar for that film. He was the first African-American to win the Best Acting Oscar. It's an amazing film. I also saw The Proud Valley from 1938 or 1939. It was just before the Second World War, so one of the oldest films I've seen in a while, starring Paul Robeson, who was a famous singer. This one is set in a Welsh mining valley. Yeah, really, really good, really, really tense film. Again, with our sort of modern sort of taste and understanding of film, generally we find a lot of older movies to be quite slow-paced because, filmmaking is the pace is certainly sped up. Although I'd say, The Proud Valley was slower at times than what we used to. It got incredibly tense at some point, especially like a film set in a coal mine where there's lots of scope for accidents and disaster. So yeah, I highly recommend both those films. In the Heat of the Night is much more widely available. Definitely worth watching because is one of those, is a real classic film. And yeah, also the BFI is just doing loads of really interesting seasons. This Black Star season has been really, really good. And yeah, and sort of up there with some of the great film sequences they've done in the past. So yeah, if you're in London, I do recommend subscribing to the BFI mailing list and seeing the interesting selections of films they come up with.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's now finished, presumably.
Yeah, I think it finished in November. But yeah, but the films are obviously still available. So yeah, I definitely recommend anyone who's interested in film in general, definitely watch In the Heat of the Night, because it's an excellent film and definitely worth seeing.
Okay, and first up this week, we're doing The Hanging Tree by Ben Aaronovitch, our first full-length novel to be done on this podcast. Yes, we did do the first part of that serialised novel by Warren Ellis, but this time we read an entire book, or in Alastair's case, I think, listen to the audio. And yeah, this is the 6th book in his ongoing Peter Grant series, I guess. The series of books that started with Rivers of London. I think the franchise is now just called Rivers of London, for the most part, to evade any confusion. This 6th book brings Peter Grant back to London after a short detour to the home counties in the last one, and really re-engages with the arc plot, which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute. There's also been comics and stuff with Rivers of London. I think, is it pretty mainstream? I think it's pretty mainstream at this stage, Rivers of London. He's certainly doing pretty well, I think.
The 4th one had adverts on the tube, and you know when you've broken the mainstream when they are advertising your books or albums or what have you in tube stations. When the people are willing to spend that kind of money on your books, you're popular.
He was part of some City Read, the initiative, where they gave out copies of the first Rivers of London book called Rivers of London all over the city, and everyone was meant to be reading it in one go, and so yeah, I think he's definitely doing all right. This is definitely big business at this stage. So yes, we've read book 6. Alastair, what did you think?
Yeah, I really liked it. Yeah, for the first time in a while, a book that I really got into, to the point that I was at first cannoning through it as fast as possible because I just wanted more and more and more. And then I got to that point when I realised I'm in the final third. So I actually need to slow down a bit and savour the last few chapters before I get to the end. So it's been quite a long time since I've been so completely engrossed in a novel. It helps, obviously, that I'm a big fan of the previous 5 books in the series and read one of the graphic novels. I think there's about 3 or 4. Yeah, really liked it. It's just the really vivid writing. Like Peter Grant, the main character, it's all written from his point of view, is just a great protagonist to spend time with and sort of listen to his wry observations about things. Reading this book, it's kind of like you're sitting in a room with a friend who's kind of just telling you this great yarn about their life and the things they've been involved in.
The voice is always really good. It's always just really readable, to be honest. It's always quite easy, as you say, to just cannon straight through them, because Peter Grant's voice does just slip down. It's just very vivid, very funny, communicates the story, explains this whole magic system he's got, which is certainly getting quite complicated at this point. That makes it all seem comparatively accessible.
Each novel sort of builds out the universe of Rivers of London a bit more. So we probably should say, for any listeners who haven't read any of the books, that Peter Grant is a policeman in the Metropolitan Police, and he's sort of a trainee detective in the branch of the Metropolitan Police that deals with magic and magic-related crimes in London. Also, at the same time, he's an apprentice wizard, and his sort of master wizard is the head of this magical crimes division, who's called Nightingale, who's a very, very old wizard. He's been around since about the sort of Second World War time, but seems to have somehow kept himself young through magic. And there's this beautiful, really realised world where various magical things go on. For example, each river in London has a god that he interacts with. This one, he mainly deals with the goddess of the River Tyburn. I mean, the novel's called The Hanging Tree, and they obviously used to hang people next to the Tyburn, round about where Marble Arch is these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, it builds out the novel. Like, you get more detail in this novel about the Little Crocodiles, a group at Oxford University who learned magic and at one point have trained an evil wizard who is Peter Grant's main nemesis. Find out about the American people who are tasked with investigating magic, who kind of come to London and trample over Peter Grant's jurisdiction.
It's like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them in that way. It's time for the American branch of this, so far, quite British approach to magic.
Yeah, and they build up other wizards from different magical traditions. There's a Somali wizard in this one. There's a woman who spent a lot of time in India learning magic. They're really going international with this one, despite the fact it's still set in London. I guess London's a global city, so it works.
Yeah, I did like the sort of the moves forward with the Uber plot, but as you say, a lot of the stuff in this book seemed to be devoted to sort of finally actually inching forward the main ongoing storyline that's been going since book one regarding this mysterious villain who... we could probably do this without actually spoiling the developments, can't we? I'm so not planning on critiquing them in great length. I liked them, they were good.
We'll keep it as spoiler-free as possible, but if you are chronically adverse to spoilers for any of the previous novels, maybe best to stick to this, because we might spoil something in one of the novels, but we'll try at least keep The Hanging Tree itself relatively spoiler-light, especially as it's not actually out in paperback yet, and I do know lots of people like to wait for the paperback.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I bought it on digital. I sometimes forget that books have, like, physical properties.
I listened to the audiobook, and also I must say that the audiobook is beautifully produced. Cobner Holbrook Smith reads the novel amazingly and does a really, really great performance of all the characters. I mean, he's really great at getting Peter Grant down and his sort of sarcastic quips to the reader, but also he does a brilliant, Nightingale.
But yeah, I do like his sort of increased tangible confidence. Peter Grant, that is, not the audiobook narrator. It's one of the things that makes these books good, I think, as well as the fun, readable narration and the magic system. It's the fact that the characters do feel real and tangible, and the fact that Peter Grant started off in book one not knowing that magic existed and has now, by book six, become slightly more confident and slightly more relaxed in this world is, I think, very present, and it's sort of used to good effect and not in a cartoonish Glee type way. Part of me would have liked a stronger actual plot to this book in some ways, or a sort of, I guess what I'd say is that books 1 to 5 all sort of dealt with a specific sort of area or new bit of magic or bit of London and how the magic affects that. Like, again, try to avoid spoilers, but I think these are things that are fairly obvious from the titles. Book 1 was about the rivers, book 2 was about jazz broadly, book 3 was...
Jazz and Soho, yeah.
Yeah, book 3 was about the Tube, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was about the Tube, and specifically based in the Notting Hill area.
Yeah, book 4 was about that tower block in Everton Castle, wasn't it? It was the architecture one.
Yeah, book 4 is when they go into architecture, when they have, basically, they invent a fictional architect who's basically supposed to be Erno Goldfinger, because they visit his former house that's in Highgate, where Erno Goldfinger's house is, and there's a big tower block in Elephant Castle called Sky Garden, where most of the action takes place, which is, I think, supposed to be Alexander Fleming House, which is a large brutalist Erno Goldfinger building next to Elephant Castle tube station.
Yeah, and in book 5, the gimmick was that he left London and had to investigate a magical crime in the home counties. I think it was Herefordshire. But yeah, book 6... Yeah, I don't know, part of me would have liked them to actually really go into another new area or introduce another new bit of London or bit of magic or element. But it was just sort of, here are the characters again, here's a relatively slight mystery, and here's some advance in the Uber plot. Maybe it's just because there's been a slightly longer wait for this book than the others. I think it's been about 2 or 3 years instead of the others were all relatively fast, coming out annually.
Most of the events in this novel take place along the River Tyburn. It sort of starts and has major plot developments in Mayfair area. Things go down in Green Park, but also he leaves London at a few points because the case he's investigating this time is the death of a teenager at a sort of drugs-filled party, quite a wealthy teenager, so he's obviously interviewing parents and stuff of these wealthy teenagers at their kind of big houses out in the countryside. But you do get, some progression of the kind of magical story, a lot of it takes place in a pub called the Cherry Tree, which is just next to River Tyburn. That's kind of the go-to pub for magical people in London. Yeah,
that's a good new location. I'm sure you can get a lot out of having a sort of a magical hangout. I'll be surprised if that doesn't come back up in future books.
Yeah, the main one I think is this does advance, like you say, the main plot, the overall arc plot of this one takes a big step forwards. Considering book 5, the main plot was kind of put on the back burner for a bit. Whereas, this one, it was a big sort of surge forward. There was a lot of... Basically, it mainly advanced the plot in regards to Peter Grant and Nightingale's attempts to arrest an evil wizard who's been harassing them since book 2, who they call the Faceless Man, partly because he's cast a spell on his face that no one can see what it is. And also this book does... not say too much of a spoiler, but it does contain one scene I've been looking forward to for a long time, which is when Nightingale finally gets to face off against the Faceless Man, and you get kind of 2 fully trained wizards battling it out with magic, and that's a good scene.
Yeah, I always find it frustrating, I guess in a good way, because I think you're sort of meant to. The way he's very strict about this first-person viewpoint, like, it's very much from Peter Grant's perspective, and if Peter Grant doesn't see something, then you don't see something. You just sort of hear about it in very broad, I think this is happening terms.
Yeah.
Some people, some authors might entirely legitimately, in order to get more stuff in, try and sort of trick their way around the first-person viewpoint by having, Peter Grant relay something that someone else has said to him or something like that. But these books are very disciplined in not going beyond that and not letting themselves cheat. And the bits there's working my way around the spoiler. There's some stuff at the end which sounds quite impressive, but part of me was like, that book might have actually been more impressive if we'd had sort of an actual detailed account of it from Peter Grant's perspective, but obviously we didn't because Peter Grant wasn't there. You just get him describing his slightly lower level grunt work whilst commenting that this is probably happening somewhere.
I think one of the crucial things is that Peter Grant is not only the point of view character, but he is active in every scene. So in the confrontation between Nightingale and the Faceless Man, they could have had a bit when Peter Grant was kind of just spectating from the sidelines, but it's not in Peter Grant's nature to be just spectating the scene, so he had to be elsewhere doing something active, because he's always active, he's always doing something. So that's why we don't get as much of the duel between the Faceless Man and Nightingale as we might have liked. But also partly because magic in this book is quite esoteric. I think it might not have been a particularly interesting scene to see the particulars of a duel between wizards of a high order, because they would be kind of just constantly blocking each other and kind of subverting each other. You know, it might be a difficult thing to convey written down, so I think that's why the story goes elsewhere at that point.
I mean, it may well be just because Aaronovitch is saving that for like the full-on higher-level wizard duel experience for a later book, or he's sort of putting it off until Peter Grant is trained up enough so he can have it done from, actually from Peter Grant's perspective.
Well, in book 2 and in book 4, Peter Grant faces off against the Faceless Man. For both times, the Faceless Man is clearly a superior wizard, so Peter Grant has to use his intelligence, to sort of trick in some way, mainly just to escape and survive.
Yeah.
Because he can't face off against the Faceless Man. He's just not well trained enough. Obviously, Nightingale is a very experienced wizard and also was part of the British magical forces in World War II, so he's used to magical warfare. But the Faceless Man is also, as has been established, sort of quite a nasty sadist. So he's a good villain. He's quite scary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Aaronovitch has an ending point in mind. Someone asked him this once at a panel when I was there, how long will the series go on for? And he just said, until I can afford a yacht, which could either genuinely mean I'm just going to carry it on forever, or could just mean I don't want to tell you.
I think he's going to keep writing them until he runs out of ideas. I mean, even if they finish the current arc plot with the Faceless Man as this big villain, they could introduce new villains. They've been teasing the return of Mr. Punch, the spirit of riot and rebellion, who was the villain in the first novel.
I mean, he has taken a substantial leap forward in the arc plot here, but I guess not one that necessitates ending it. I mean, because I also, in the last 2 weeks, read the first volume of the comics, which Alastair very generously lent me, which is called Bodywork, which is about cars, basically. It's about magical cars. It's on the cover. And yeah, that almost had more of a sort of, here's an actual new area of magic than this book did. I don't know whether he's going to, focus on the arc plot in the books now and use the comics to just toss off his fun new magical world-building ideas, or whether that's a bit of a massive, broad oversimplification and really he'll just do what he wants.
I think he's probably developing it in as many different ways as possible. They're doing comics now, they've got novels, novellas, there's been rumoured there's a TV show coming at some point. I think that'll be a straight adaptation of the first book.
It's a very TV-friendly property. To be honest, one of my main source of disappointments with this book is that the fact that it's not a TV show means I don't get a new one next week to explore a new aspect of the world or actually see how the small advances in the arc plot affect everything. I'm going to have to now wait another year or two.
They certainly do lend themselves to being filmed. I think one of the reasons for that is that Ben Aaronovitch originally cut his teeth as a TV writer. I know he wrote for Blake 7, classic BBC science fiction show, very similar to Firefly. He also wrote for original Doctor Who back in the 1980s.
Wow.
He wrote for some of the later ones. He wrote one of the best ones ever, Remembrance of the Daleks, which was the last appearance of the Daleks before they were revived by Russell T Davies in 2005. And that's a very good Doctor Who adventure. So yeah, he started as a TV writer, but I think got to the point when, because it's difficult to get stuff commissioned, especially in British television where there's not a huge amount of money. So I think he'd switched to novels because they're easier to sell and get made.
I don't know whether he could go back into TV now that he's got a pretty big name as a novelist, but then again, the gaps between Rivers of London books will probably get even longer, so,
Yeah.
Well, we can't complain. But yeah, the comics, based on the one volume I've read, the comics are pretty fun. If you enjoyed the books and want some more, they're definitely worth a look.
Also, I must say, these novels are great for diversity. If you like your fantasy or urban fantasy to come as diverse as possible, like, say, Peter Grant, his mum is from Haiti or Jamaica, I should have noted that, but I don't have specifically which one. His dad is a famous Soho jazz musician. Oh, a white jazz musician and stuff. There's a great character which has been in a few of the previous novels, and in that bodywork one, Gulid, also known as the Muslim Ninja. She's another trainee detective in the area of the Met that deals with homicide. And there's usually a lot of crossover between the magical area of the Met and the homicide area of the Met, because there are magical homicides. And one of the great stuff is the various people who work in the homicide squad lacking patience with Peter Grant and, as they call it, his weird bollocks. And also his penchant for property damage, as whenever he gets involved, things tend to explode or collapse.
Yeah, there's been a few enjoyable, oh dear, that whole thing's fallen down moments in the last few books.
Yeah,
it's probably one of my favourite book series currently running. I do follow a few, but yeah, these are very much in my wheelhouse with the London, the fist-on of magic, the not dark humour exactly, the sort of the wry humour, I guess. Peter Grant, he is blessed with the rare ability to be sort of funny and slightly snarky about things, but not come across as a dick, which is definitely always a challenge to put off. For some reason, in the last few months, I've always been possibly because I've been watching a lot of Parks and Recreation, I am always impressed with the ability to be funny without necessarily being miserable.
Yeah, it's a difficult line to walk. He's got charisma. He's the sort of person you want to spend time with, Peter Grant, which is, I think, why people love these novels so much. Next up, we'll be discussing The Grand Tour, a new motoring show starring Jeremy Clarkson, James May, and Richard Hammond, formerly of the BBC and now on Amazon Prime. 3 middle-aged car-driving lads have been reunited to review supercars, drive around at insane speeds, and do crazy car-themed challenges and exchange quips. The only difference is that now they are on a grand tour. You should see me doing the air quotes there, and are at a different location around the globe each week. We've watched the first 3 episodes that are now up on Amazon Prime. Nick, what did you make of all of this?
Well, I think, for being honest, the main difference this time is now they've got a bumload of money. That seems to be the core change here.
Yeah.
We reviewed the BBC revival of Top Gear, which was, they used to make roughly the same show on the BBC as under the longer-running Top Gear brand. They then left under a bit of a messy circumstances because Jeremy Clarkson, after a number of controversial occurrences, had an altercation with a producer and was sort of let go, and the others all went with him, and Amazon picked them up. And yeah, it's basically that show. In some ways, this is basically review-proof because it's for fans of the Clarkson, Hammond and May version of Top Gear. It's now, look, we're now doing that on Amazon, so if you want that, come and get that. And I am not averse to it as a bit of entertainment, but it started to get a bit samey a few years ago for me, so I haven't actually watched the Clarkson, Hammond, May Top Gear for a few years. And I gave this a go, and they have, on the one hand, they have managed to go, look, it's us again, we're back, doing what you like us to do. But unfortunately for the BBC, Clarkson, Hammond and May seem slightly liberated by having ditched the more formulaic, constraining parts of the Top Gear format. The fact that they can do whatever they want is, to be honest, at the end of my analysis of this, the fact that they've got loads of money and freedom and can do whatever they want is both the main strength and the main weakness of this. Because on the one hand, it means it's a lot less formulaic than Top Gear was. It does feel a lot more interesting and unpredictable. You don't necessarily sit down going, it's time for this again. On the other hand, it's also the downside because, as often happens when you do your big sort of, we've got infinite money and infinite license to do what you like, vanity projects, you can sometimes go a bit self-indulgent. And there are bits on this which do come dangerously close to leaving me sitting there going, I get the feeling this is a lot more fun for you than it is for me. But it has to be said, those bits were relatively few and far between. And for the most part, it's still pretty fun, and they do seem to have been slightly reinvigorated by the new format. Alastair, what did you think? Yeah,
I would agree with the reinvigoration from the new format. As almost every fan of Top Gear echo what you said earlier, which is that it was great when they were on the BBC. Like, certainly when they redid the lineup with Clarkson, Hammond and May, they breathed a lot of life into the show, and it was very fun for quite a few years, and then it kind of got a bit staid, and they kept doing the same things, and, it kind of became a bit, I don't know, not necessarily phoning it in, but a little bit tired. And now that they've left and they've moved to Amazon Prime, you get the feeling they're actually trying again to make it entertaining, and when they try to make it entertaining, it is very good. I mean, the one thing about this show is that it is just lots of fun. Even as someone who's not particularly interested in cars, it was gripping and just fun. It's just, like I say, it's just a bunch of lads being lads with their car, with their cars. obviously they have great chemistry, the three presenters. They have great charisma together. I mean, Clarkson is really not my sort of type of person. His politics are pretty repugnant. But, they just do entertaining well. I think I'm going to steal this from a friend, saying that Top Gear was originally an actually quite dry car review show when they used to drive around in sort of family hatchbacks and sort of discuss how good they were at like changing gear. And then under Clarkson, Hammond and May, the whole thing kind of got rebranded as a general car-themed entertainment show. And they've definitely picked up the general car-themed entertainment show aspect of it to make it basically really, really entertaining. And occasionally discuss like Aston Martins or BMWs.
Yeah, I was like, the fact that they could do whatever they want in an episode means they do just sort of run through their sort of box of tricks a bit. And but in the first episode, they actually did do a surprising amount of actual car journalism. Like, they actually made an effort to actually review and compare some cars.
I got the feeling in the first episode they wanted to be like, this is definitely a car show. They wanted to stamp that on it from the first. Like, this is not, you haven't just paid to see them twatting around. Even as funny as that is, it's basically they want to say there will be some serious car journalism in that first episode, and it kind of did decline a bit. Like in the third episode, they didn't even test drive any cars.
No, they didn't. There was a few bits where they tried to talk in sort of their serious journalist voices about the cars they were driving during that sort of the lengthy road trip film that made up most of that episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it does mostly work because, as you say, it's since they took over, it's mostly just been a show about them twatting around, or at least a lot of people are watching it for them twatting around and just sort of grin and bear the parts where they actually review some cars.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, the third episode with that lengthy road trip bit was probably the closest to like strict old school Top Gear. It was just them sort of low key twatting around. Some of it was obviously like heavily scripted, but it wasn't so painfully fake that you just sort of withdrew from it a bit, which is kind of... Yeah, I wasn't a vast fan of the heavy military equipment bit in episode 2, where they spent about half an hour reenacting a sort of military exercise.
They go to Jordan to a special forces training area so they can do some ridiculous hostage rescue training. And that was clearly one of the most sort of heavily scripted parts of
I don't know. I mean, the thing is, they're clearly sort of messing around with the tone and the level of the comedy and stuff. Like in episode 3, the comedy was sort of about what they used to do on Top Gear, which is sort of, it's just us three making a TV show. You know, we're aware that we're making a TV show, but we're trying to sort of do comedy within that sphere. Whereas in episode 2, they sort of did this slightly higher level of massive slapstick, or that ridiculous bit where Jeremy Clarkson pretended to be stuck in a window, or the weird conceit that they actually were shooting actual bullets.
Yeah, that seemed a bit strange, yeah.
It was a bit strange, and it's just, I don't know, maybe people who are less analysis heavy than me were able to just relax and go with it, but that segment specifically was the bit where I just thought you've lost something here. You've thrown the suspension of disbelief slightly off. You've got a bit too self-indulgent. I appreciate this is fun for you, but the comedy bits are just too silly. And the idea that there was another bit where James May had to run to get to a car and just kept saying and doing the same thing again and again and again and again. The conceit that they had to restart the mission every time one of them fake died was quite funny, but they sort of used it in this really weird slapstick way that was just slightly sillier than they usually go, and it just didn't quite work for me. The broad self-indulgent stuff, it just feels like they've slightly lost the idea that, I don't know, for me the appeal of Top Gear is they've created this sort of illusion of we're just some guys making a TV show, you know, it's just, you know, this could be you and your mates if you happen to be car journalists with this much money.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, which is Top Gear or Grand Tour, kind of interchangeable at this point, is at its best when it's a kind of, you know, this could be you and your friends larking around if you had like really, really cool cars and went to exotic locations. And it gets to its worst when Jeremy Clarkson believes that he's the voice of a forgotten generation of no-nonsense white straight men. The good news is that they did avoid it being at its worst, even though they did have digs at the BBC, especially in the first episode. They also made quite a lot of self-consciously un-PC jokes, you know, making jokes about various English councils and their plans to like rebuild roundabouts and just basically making fun of them a lot. There's a joke at one point where having a Romanian person driving a car for Clarkson, you know, making sort of jokes about how the fact you can't say prick tease on TV and things like that, despite the fact they are saying it over and over on TV. I mean, they do that in some way, I think, quite awkward, sort of, we're deliberately being un-PC, which is kind of where Top Gear gets to its, or, you know, the Grand Tour gets to its most self-indulgent for me. Those points when Clarkson basically thinks he's the voice of the kind of, the people who can't say anything because we're like, you know, white and straight and male and like cars. Despite the fact these are the people we pretty much always hear from all the time and are convinced we don't hear enough of. So they did have a bit of that, which I find really annoying. And, Jeremy Clarkson gets to his sort of most self-righteous in his newspaper columns. But they did have a bit of that, but fortunately, for me, not enough to put me off the show entirely. They did have enough of basically the good aspects of some friends having fun together, driving around in cars, and just sort of generally being entertaining.
Well, yeah, they have the weekly segments Conversation Street, which it's a terrible name, but clearly it's meant to be terrible, which does usually involve, them setting the world to right in a slightly, these days, can you believe it, type way, which is just, as you increasingly visibly age, guys, this does just start to look a bit old man yells at cloud.
Yeah, generally, the Conversation Street, that's one of the aspects of the show that actually I wanted more car. Like, generally, as someone who's not particularly interested in cars, I prefer the larking around to the kind of car reviewing. But when they did Conversation Street and they talked specifically about cars and things car manufacturers were working on, I found that quite interesting. When they kind of just basically made jokes about, we can't say this because it's not PC, even though you're saying it, or they're making jokes about, this council, the council's done this, the council's done that, or, having a go at...
their rocking chair outside their house, waving their shotgun at council workers.
Having a go at teenagers for not learning to drive because you don't get a proper education these days, but you are taught to hate cars. And basically it's like, put a sock in it, Clarkson. We're not here to listen to you dribble.
The only part that was actually quite an interesting statistic in its way. I mean, I would not have been averse to an actual serious attempt to discuss why people aren't learning to drive nowadays.
Because people are concerned about climate change, which Jeremy Clarkson denies. Well, at least I believe he has denied in the past.
Okay, I was assuming it was just because we have slightly better public transport because more young people live in cities, but fair enough.
Actually, no, to be fair, you are right. There is lots of aspects in this, and I think there is a problem in that, people have, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, relocated en masse to cities, not just large cities like London, but cities in general, hence housing crisis. But yeah, so you're right, they could have had a decent conversation about that rather than Clarkson just gets snippy at the school system.
Yes, they could. And also, other regular segments that annoy me. Celebrity Brain Crash. That's a diminishing returns self-indulgent joke.
It was funny the first time.
It was just about funny the first time. Although the fact that they did it, was it 3 times in the first episode? Meant it had pretty much died by the end of that first time. Yeah,
so I assume no one's particularly concerned about spoilers for the Grand Tour.
Spoilers for the Grand Tour, yeah.
Spoiler alert, they drive cars and it's fun.
Spoiler alert, every week they go, it's time to play Celebrity Brain Crash. And then they make out that they're going to bring a celebrity on to play on an old arcade machine, it looks like. And then, instead, the celebrity just tries to walk towards their tent and then dies in a slapstick way. The deaths aren't over the top and funny enough for it to be funny in that way, so it's just the concept of a celebrity dying, which isn't that funny when you have it clearly signposted that you're going to do it the same way every week.
Well, I liked it the first time when they were clearly sending up the format, because they must have at some point had a discussion of so how much of the Top Gear format are we going to import and how much are we going to have it as its own thing? Because, this is Top Gear, but just with more money, like as you said, and on Amazon Prime. So, for example, they still basically drive around supercars. They still speed test cars on the same track each week with the same driver. Though this time it's not the Stig because the BBC have held on to copyright for him. Yeah, so they managed to import kind of some of the aspects of Top Gear, but the star in the reasonably priced car aspect, which I assume they're basically spoofing with Celebrity Brain Hack. I like the fact they're sending up the format of we'll get a celebrity on each week, and each week they're like, oh, we've got celebrity, no we don't. But yeah, the joke does wear quite thin quite quickly.
I mean, maybe if they played with the joke a bit more and had this week the celebrity calls up and says, I'm not coming, it was a trick or something. But the fact that they're doing exactly the same joke every week is just getting a bit much. But never mind, it's only about 5 minutes and I can mostly ignore it. But that and some of the more old man ranty parts of Conversation Street were generally the part where I rolled my eyes and checked my phone.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree with that. But they kept some of the bits about the general car-themed entertainment of Top Gear.
I can't really argue with them getting rid of the celebrity interview for the most part. It was very rarely the best part of Top Gear. Every so often you get someone on who actually had good chemistry with Clarkson or who was particularly infused or funny, but a lot of the time it was just a bit awkward.
Like a lot of shows, it's basically ex-celebrity is plugging their movie this week. So, it's the same as if you watch Graham Norton. Graham Norton's only good if you're interested in the celebrity, or you get someone like, Bill Murray on who's just objectively hilarious.
So yeah, I can't really blame them for ditching that bit. It's fine. And yeah, unfortunately, the comparison doesn't stand well for the BBC version of Top Gear, which does look a bit like a sort of slightly stayed cover version compared to this.
Yeah, that's the one thing. Is this is much better than the BBC reboot of Top Gear, and it is partly because, and as we discussed when we reviewed the new Top Gear, that it is the fact that obviously Clarkson, Hammond and May have been working together for years. They've been doing live shows, books, radio, TV, loads of stuff. They've nailed the chemistry. They've nailed it to the degree that sometimes it becomes clunky because they've nailed it so much. But they are just great together and really, really good. And like I say, yeah, Matt LeBlanc and Chris Evans could not manufacture that instantly overnight, which is, I guess, not their fault. But their show is inferior to this one.
Yeah, and the fact that they changed nothing, the fact that they did just try and make the same show but plugging different presenters in, it just sort of made that a bit too obvious. They could have changed the set, they could have ditched a Stig, they could have done different segments, they could have made an effort. They could have made an effort to go, this is a whole new show. But unfortunately, and perhaps ironically, they made the sort of staid version of what existed, and the guys who actually are the sort of the staid guys who've been there for years have made enough of an effort to reinvent themselves that their thing seems newer and fresher. So
yeah,
bad luck.
They made enough of an effort to make it seem original whilst keeping the things everyone loves, which is basically the laddish banter of a group of people whose collective age is probably, closer to like 120. They are at their best when they're kind of driving around in cars, sort of like making quips, like in the Italy one in the third episode when Clarkson and May have these really refined sort of supercars, and like sort of Hammond's going around in his muscle car making a load of noise and being very uncouth, and the others are sort of giving him withering looks. That's funny. And Grand Tour's at its best when they do that, which is what the new Top Gear didn't have. It's at its worst when the old Top Gear got to the point of they believed their own hype and believed they were, like, again, the voice of a forgotten generation of balding, slightly overweight, middle-aged men. And they've not got to that point yet, so it's all right.
Yeah, and for the most part, but when they're not ranting, there is enough sort of self-aware, self-deprecation for it to seem like they're, aware of their own massive glaring flaws, which is what makes it kind of work and kind of watchable.
Yeah. James May, I think, is the best at that, and that's why he's probably my favourite of the presenters. Partly because he does great shows about beer and trains and stuff when he's not on Top Gear.
Well, yeah, Clarkson is a difficult figure to like sometimes, and Richard Hammond has been somewhat ruined for me by that ubiquitous Stuart Lee routine.
Yeah, that, and he was on that terrible, terrible show, Total Wipeout, which was always on before Doctor Who. And so if you wanted to watch Doctor Who, you had to sit through at least 10 minutes of Richard Hammond grinning inanely at the camera.
But anyway, yes, the Grand Tour. You probably already know if you like this, and if you're inclined to like it, you probably will.
I think if you like old Top Gear, but you're sitting on the fence about this show, I think go for it. You'll like it, at least the first couple of episodes. If you have a sort of venomous reaction to Jeremy Clarkson, probably not your TV show.
Probably don't spend £100 on Amazon Prime for this, just a thought.
Or if you do, watch Man in the High Castle instead, because it's better.
Then Preacher.
Yes.
And Parks and Recreation.
Yes.
Okay, third up this fortnight, we are revisiting the YA Doctor Who spin-off Class, set in Cold Hill Academy following a group of students who have been tasked by the Doctor, some might say slightly unfairly, to deal, basically on their own, with a range of weird time and space anomalies and aliens and menaces coming through these cracks that are opening up all around the school. Yes, we've now seen the whole first series, all 8 glorious episodes, completing the Shadowkin arc, which ran through the whole thing. And, yeah, we're going to revisit it quickly to let you know what we thought of the whole thing, since, we're big Doctor Who fans and there's been no Doctor Who this year, which, as I may have said before, makes it a really good choice of time to start our pop culture podcast. So, yep, Alastair, what did you think of the whole of Series 1 of Class?
Well, similar to the Grand Tour, I would say when it was at its best, it was very, very good. When it was at its worst, I found it a bit clunky and somewhat irritable. But overall, I would say positive emotions coming out of it. Possibly, I'd say my favourite Doctor Who spin-off. Certainly miles better than Torchwood, which just makes me cringe every time I say it out loud. Not because of the name, because of, it just was bad. It had some really good ideas in it, and I like stuff that, tries to do new things, tries to do, good ideas. I really liked there's an episode that all takes place in real time when they're in detention, and they're kind of the room that the 5 student characters is in gets blasted out of time. All the drama is character based, about character interaction. That episode was really good, and overall I had positive views. We will probably come to the bits I didn't like in a bit, but Nick, what was your take on it?
my main note at the top really is probably kind of a missed opportunity. There's some individual episodes that are really good. My personal highlights were probably episodes 2 and 3, which were the two, this is not a coincidence, probably the two main episodes that are basically standalone and didn't really tie extensively into their sort of arc plot.
Well, the Arse Dragon and the Tree.
Yeah, the one with the Arse Dragon and the one with the tree thing. Yeah, I thought those were both quite good. Again, I'd say sort of Buffy-esque bits of teen sci-fi fantasy business. I enjoyed them a lot. The sort of the soap opera was quite well played. They had usually a few good jokes. They had some good character bits. Very good. A+. Unfortunately, the other 6 episodes kind of variable. I mean, if I was doing my league table of Doctor Who spin-offs, and as geeks we are all clearly doing that in our minds, I would probably put Sarah Jane Adventures above this, and like a fair chunk above this, actually, because I think it, although yes, it is aimed at literal children, it is aimed at an even younger audience than Doctor Who. Sarah Jane Adventures succeeds on its own terms very well. It's very good at what it does, although what it does is not aimed at adults. And yet I quite enjoyed it. Infer from that what you will. This, I don't know if this succeeds on its own terms that well. I think fundamentally it's built around an arc plot that I found quite clunky and annoying, and unfortunately it seemed very determined to ram that arc plot hard into most of the episodes. Like, there's only 8 episodes in the series, 4 of them, so half of them, deal fairly extensively with the arc plot. 2 of the others don't actually have the arc plot like right up there in them, but are still dealing with arc stuff quite heavily, and the other 2 are the 2 standalones, which were my favourites. You can sort of chart my liking of a Class episode fairly accurately based on to what extent is the arc plot with the Shadowkin in it.
That's interesting that we have had basically the opposite reaction to it, in that I preferred the arc plots to the non-arc ones. I think one of the reasons why is that when Doctor Who does Monster of the Week, which it does quite regularly, some of the monsters are a bit naff, and I always feel that like the spin-offs get stuck with the naffest monsters because, you know, the best ideas must go to the main show. So what I liked about Class is they kind of mainly stuck with one villain, the Shadowkin, because at least it meant they weren't.
But it was a shit villain. Sorry,
it wasn't as naff as the Arse Dragon. Come on, or the Tree.
The Arse Dragon and the Tree were one-off villains, as you say. Yes, they're on some level a bit naff, but they served their purpose. The Shadowkin would have been fine as a 1 or even 2-part villain, but after 8 episodes built heavily around them, my second note is the Shadowkin could fuck right off, which is about where I'm at with this.
Well, that's an episode. That's the episode title. They weren't great, but they weren't too bad. They were evil. They were menacing.
They were men in big black rubber suits. It looks like rocks.
Well, everything looks crap on the BBC budget. But unless you come up with something that is like quite simple but very iconic and scary, a la Daleks or Weeping Angels. You know, occasionally they get it right. But a lot of the time, the bits of a car you find in a skip behind a BBC TV station don't necessarily yield genius ideas all the time. By the way, that's a true story. Daleks was made from bits of a Morris Minor discarded in a skip behind the BBC studio.
And the Daleks do look ridiculous, and a lot of...
But they are scary and they look convincing.
I think a lot of the sort of scariness of the Daleks, the fact that the Daleks work, is built off sort of legacy and the fact that they've got this big history, rather than because they themselves are amazing.
No, the Daleks are scary because they don't look like anything recognisably alive. They look inhuman.
It is true. The fact that they've gone substantially away from it's a dude in a suit is, I think, possibly one of the things that has helped that endure a bit.
Yeah, considering the original Cybermen were clearly people wrapped in tinfoil with Weetabix boxes glued to them and spray-painted silver, the Daleks looked fucking amazing by comparison. But anyway, dragging this back to Class, the Shadowkin, I think they did work because, like, a lot of shows are at their strongest, or any writing or fiction is at their strongest, when you have 3 areas of conflict. Personal conflict, characters conflict within themselves. Interpersonal conflict, relationships, basically soap opera stuff. And extrapersonal conflicts with either the environment or society or bigger things, right? And shows work at their best, or anything works at their best, when the 3 move together. And the thing about the Shadowkins, they managed to tie the story up, I think, in quite a neat way, in that because there was the plot line of the Shadowkin king sharing their heart with the April character, meant there was a interpersonal element to the conflict. The fact that Charlie could wipe them out at any point because he had a super weapon in his lounge but was concerned about using it meant there was a personal element to the conflict. They managed to unite the 3 together to create a moment of drama could turn all 3 forms of conflict, which worked well.
I don't deny if that works structurally, but the trouble is that also means the Shadowkin are like wrapped into every element of the series, which does create a certain problem with liking the series if you decided that the Shadowkin are fucking terrible.
Yeah, I suppose I would agree with that. One thing I found hugely disappointing is my favourite plotline from the whole series was the petals. I thought that was a really clever idea. This feeds on flesh it comes into contact with and multiplies. And it starts with one, but obviously because it grows even faster than exponentially, in a few days it could consume the whole world. That was good. I found that was scary. And also, again, you had no idea the petals, they just kind of look like a force of nature. You can't reason with them, you can't talk to them, they just keep going. And I thought that was quite good. And then it was a B plot line for 2 episodes. And then
that was a really good, interesting sci-fi concept. I would have liked to have seen more of that, but unfortunately the episodes it was in had all their space taken up by the fucking Shadowkin. Yeah, that 2-parter was probably the low point of the whole series for me, unfortunately, because even though it did have the petals thing in it, which was really good, it had some of the worst Shadowkin stuff, and it's really, really felt like a 1-part episode that had been dragged out to 2 episodes via lots of really long, annoying, interminable conversations.
Yeah, I must say, I would agree with you that the low point was probably episode 5, the second half of the 2-parter. When they go to the Shadowkin world, it was class at its worst, filled with clunky dialogue, exposition, things people would never actually say, just sort of random, just kind of endless talking. But the court politics of the Shadowkin, like, why do we need that? Their weird rituals and stuff that also made no sense, despite the fact we got them in staggering levels of detail. It was clunky, it was exposition heavy, it wasn't particularly fun to watch, so yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, trying to rise up and analyse my feelings on the Shadowkin in a slightly deeper way than just facetiously swearing. As I say, they would have been fine in a couple of episodes, but there's just something innately disposable and uninteresting and inhuman about them, and not in a scary or interesting way. They just don't really want anything or achieve anything. It's the same reason the Cybermen, to be honest, are innately B-list and boring. Sorry, Cybermen. Sorry, Cybermen fans. Sorry. But there's a reason why every time someone brings back the Cybermen, if you look, you can find an interview with the writer saying, I'm finally going to make the Cybermen work, or I'm finally going to make the Cybermen scary. And it's because they're never that scary. They're just kind of dull alien foot soldiers whose only real power is that there's lots of them and they probably want to kill you, but for reasons that are never that well defined and never seem that high stakes. They're just meat for fight scenes. And the Shadowkin never really felt like they rose particularly above that. It's kind of a shame that for their first big villain they didn't choose something that was a human, or could be given a human face due to some sci-fi gubbins.
Yeah, the governors were quite a good villain in that they were human but also strange and unusual.
That did actually annoy me as well. Spoilers, by the way. If you haven't been spoiled enough, I'm going to properly just describe the end of the last episode now.
We're going to give you both barrels for this.
The last episode, they introduced the court of the governors or something. They revealed what the governors, which have been hinted throughout the series, actually look like. And they seem like much more interesting villains. Why couldn't we have had them? Why couldn't they focus on them in the series instead of these kind of generic aliens who, even though they do, as you say, do a reasonably good, coherent job of tying Shadowkin into the plot, the fact that they're such generic, hello, I am a big black evil alien,
I've come to murder you from the shadows.
I've come to murder you from the shadows. We've really mastered that filming beat where a Shadowkin sword appears through someone out of nowhere. We can do that. And it's quite shocking the first time it happens, and it quickly becomes comical by about the 7th time it happens in the finale. And the whole finale just did hit a bit of a level of tragedy overload when the Shadowkin just appeared and stabbed another relative out of nowhere. It's just the whole finale just becomes the world's most depressing your mum joke.
Yeah, but I thought that was good actually. That it did really wrap the drama up.
It's only wraps mum up, yeah, and dad, and trying to get their mums, yeah.
But to steal a comment from my girlfriend, she made a good point that you made the comparison to Buffy. You don't actually, in Buffy, other than Buffy's mum herself, Joy, you don't get... Was it Joyce? I can't remember. You don't really actually get to know any of the other characters' parents at all. But in Class, you did. And there was a lot more collateral in that case. You basically got to know most people's parents, apart from the chronically underdeveloped Mateus. And when they were killed in the last episode, it was generally quite emotional. It really was like, whoa, the emotional stakes have risen dramatically.
Yeah, I did think, I liked those characters. It's a shame they've been killed off in service to this quite boring storyline. I think the show would have benefited more from having them still around.
Yeah, I did like Ram's dad especially. I thought he was a very good character. I thought, Ram and April were my favourite characters. They were also, probably not coincidentally, the most developed characters in the TV show. They had the best, both personal storylines and interpersonal storylines, as well as, obviously, the extra personal story that applied to everyone.
Drink every time Alastair says the word personal, guys. Drink.
Yeah, all sort of synonyms of personal.
I kind of came out of it annoyed with most of them, except for Tanya and Quill, to be honest. And Quill's I'm so sarcastic and apathetic thing did get a bit wearing at times. But at least you had a sense of humour.
Yeah, Mateus was an interesting character, and I liked his relationship with Charlie. That was a good plot line. Tumblr have gone mad for that, like a cat for catnip. Mateus himself as a character I thought was quite underdeveloped. Tanya was good. I liked her plot line of her becoming, sort of her growing stronger as time goes by. Also, I want to say shout out to Cobner Holbrook Smith, as previously discussed, narrator of all the Rivers of London audiobooks, actually acting, sort of not in an audio capacity, playing Tanya's dad.
Oh, thank God for that. I thought you were going to say he was a Shadowkin or something.
No, it was Tanya's dad, and as soon as he appeared, I was like, I recognise that voice. Wait, that's Peter Grant's voice.
Yeah, and while we're doing random shout-outs, shout out to Fadi Al-Sayed, who played Vam, who was really willing to commit to some properly contorted grief faces. Like, a lot of young hot male actors would probably really want to stick to, I'm staring, I'm brooding, I'm communicating my emotions through brooding. But he really was willing to just sob and cry and bend his face out of shape with grief. It was very impressive.
No, he was good. He was good. Ram and April, best characters. Charlie, he's a prince, he's been raised from birth. His whole thing is that he's kind of a bit sort of stoic and formal and a bit old. And obviously, I guess he's not supposed to be believable as a teenager. But my criticism is I didn't find him believable as a teenager. But Ram and April, I really did. I believed in their sort of teenage relationship. I believe that whole still thing when you're 17 and, you're in love and you think it's like a sort of transcending force because you've never felt anything like that before, with a complete lack of irony or awareness. And yeah, they were good. They nailed being teenagers. And again, Class was good when it kind of got teenagers being teenagers.
Yeah, the level of sort of heightened everything's really, really important stuff did. Yeah, it was definitely there. Sometimes I felt like they talked a bit too much. Like, there's a lot of scenes in this show where the villain is about to kill someone, or the villain has turned up, and then the villain and about 5 members of the cast just stand in a circle and have a long conversation. Come on, guys, dramatise this, actually do something.
Well, yeah, what they're trying to do is, as I said before, linking different forms of conflict together in the same scene, although sometimes, at its worst, that can be clunky, which is when a villain's about to attack, but first of all, they must have a talk about relationships.
It's always like a 10-minute talk as well. And like I say, particularly in that two-parter with the Shadowkin, there was a lot of, before we do anything, let's stand around and talk about it, normally with at least one person pointing a sword at another. It's like, my God, how heavy is that sword? Quite heavy? Is your arm not tired from holding it to his neck for what feels like about 15 minutes?
Also, are the Shadowkin swords part of their body, or are they separate? Because they're made out of the same matter, but their whole planet isn't made out of that matter, so I don't know, it doesn't make sense. Plus, also, April can conjure them because she's got some Shadowkin in her, so are the swords part of their body or not? Patrick Ness, please write in with the answer.
But yeah, I mean, I guess the easy sort of glib answer would be maybe Patrick Ness is still getting his TV writing feet on and is still working on, dramatising things and including movement in his scripts, but that's probably quite a bit of easy glib criticism. The actual answer is probably much deeper than that. It probably relates to budgets or something.
Yeah, also, while I'm being slightly unfair to Patrick Ness, actually, I think he did a really good job with this. I think the best parts of the show are, I'm sure, down to him, pretty much. Like the good writing, the good characters, the decent drama. Probably most of it came from him. I think he should definitely, pat himself on the back. He delivered for this show and made it not the really awful awkwardness that Torchwood was, because what Torchwood got was Russell T Davies giving them his B ideas because he was obviously working on the main Doctor Who show. Putting a whole separate showrunner in charge, someone who's got experience, writing books. And I think for books as well, you really have to nail that kind of the turning of the three conflicts at the same time to make your books engaging. Rivers of London does it. Lots of great books do it. That's what I aim for in my writing, and Patrick Ness managed to really get that skill down in Class and make the characters believable as teenagers and good teenage drama. So when it was good, I'm pretty sure it was down to him. Also, some great acting.
I thought it was alright. As I say, I'd have liked more standalone episodes. Personally, I thought the two sort of concurrent episodes, the detention one and the Quill solo one, kind of both felt a bit sparse, and they could, again, perhaps have been made a bit more tight and exciting and dramatic by merging them together and just cutting between the storylines. It's one of these things where I see you've taken the opportunity to do an interesting structural thing, and I feel like I should praise you for it, but unfortunately I kind of feel it would have been a better episode if you just hadn't done it.
It's also one of those Doctor Who budget things. There's in each series of Doctor Who, there's always one episode that's very Doctor heavy, one episode that's very, Doctor light and companion
Yeah,
heavy.
I forgot about those, actually. I'm sure you're right, that's probably what it is, and I'm probably being unfair saying it was done just to be structurally clever.
Well, it's done for budgetary reasons, so they can film both at the same time. So that therefore they only have to budget for 12 episodes of a series of Doctor Who, but they make 13. I mean, like I say, if you get Amazon Prime money, like Jeremy Clarkson's got, you get to do more stuff.
If only Jeremy Clarkson just gave this money to the Doctor Who team instead of making his show about fighter jets and military equipment.
No, and also Jeremy Clarkson not big on diversity, which, as Julianne said in the review in episode 19, Class is very good for diversity, and it uses diversity very well to subvert what could be quite tropey characters.
I don't know. Unfortunately, a lot of the actual storylines this series perhaps didn't quite land with me. But they've got a decent ensemble here, and I would be fully prepared to watch a second series to see if they can, tweak it a bit and make it something I'd like. I enjoyed the few episodes I enjoyed enough to believe that there's a show in here I could like, even if I wasn't 100% convinced by this particular incarnation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think, I'm looking forward to the next series because Patrick Ness will still be involved, and I think he did a good job. Also, and this is really, really spoilery, right at the end, they reveal that the governors, they're working for the Weeping Angels. I think the Weeping Angels are a good villain, and the fact that they are back and will be in the next series of Class, I thought, yeah, that's good. I'm excited for that.
I must admit, I do tend to go with the general opinion on Weeping Angels that they were really good in Blink, and it's been a certain amount of diminishing returns ever since. But I'll be interested to see if someone else can finally come up with a storyline that actually justifies bringing them back.
Last episode, I recommended that Nick watch Taxi Driver, Martin Scorsese's 1976 portrait of loneliness and isolation in New York City. Travis Bickle is a Vietnam veteran with insomnia. He takes a job as a taxi driver to pass the time and quickly becomes obsessed with how crime-ridden and disgusting New York is. I must say this is one of my absolute favourite films. It's right up there at the top of the chart. And yeah, I really, really like it. It's intense, it's dark, it's bleak. I really enjoyed getting to watch it again. But Nick, what did you think?
How deeply cheerful. Yeah, it was quite good. It was quite interesting. I don't know if I'd watch it again for entertainment, but it was quite impressive, the endless, lovely, grimy shots of the urban environment. I enjoyed the nuanced portrayal of the main character, who, as you always get in these films, actually do this sort of thing well, rather than just have this endless plunge into bleakness. There's always these sort of little moments where it looks like he's going to do something right, or he does do something correct and good or positive, and then he quickly undoes it by doing something else incredibly stupid or selfish or destructive. And then it built to a fun ending, a fun, incredibly violent shootout ending where he goes a bit Punisher. In fact, it's a very sort of uncompromising look at something like how the Punisher would go in real life, even more so than Garth Ennis's comics, which usually allow the character to be this sort of legendary force of nature, whereas this just takes a look at him and goes, look, would this person ever be functional, or even slightly? What sort of person actually does this? Yeah,
the weird thing about it is Robert De Niro is excellent in this film, and he's done many great performances throughout his career, but in this film he is really, really good. But one thing that struck me rewatching it is how much like a child he is, which is weird considering everyone remembers the incredibly violent ending to the film. But yeah, he's very innocent, and he doesn't really understand people and stuff and gets on with them. He starts dating this girl, Betsy, and then he takes her to a porno film. But not because it's not for any sexual reason, it's because that's the only thing he does. His free time, he drives a taxi, and when he's not driving a taxi, he goes to porno cinemas. And he doesn't really understand that other people do different things and behave in different ways. He just generally acts a bit odd. And there's lots of scenes of him hanging out with other taxi drivers, and he just doesn't really talk to them or converse with them, and it's always very awkward because he is just this kind of strange, quite sort of childlike person who doesn't really get other people.
But yeah, there's a bit where he tries to talk to that other taxi driver, the wizard, that guy, and he tries to explain sort of why he's upset and what's bothering him, and the other guy just seems baffled by what exactly is going on in the conversation. He just doesn't really understand what Travis is trying to communicate.
Yeah, and the other thing about Travis, though, is that he is also a creepy guy. He pretty much stalks this girl, and he also sort of later pretty much stalks Jodie Foster. He is a creepy guy, but it's kind of weird. It doesn't make excuses for him being a creepy, strange guy, but it does sort of provide an explanation in that he just doesn't get other people, and he just really can't interact with other people. He is isolated, sort of emotionally from everyone. It doesn't excuse the fact that he is a creep.
Yeah, it's some degree of nuance. It's yes, ultimately the things he's doing are creepy, but, realistically, I'm sure there are people in the world who would just take a sort of a supervillainous approach to creepiness, who do sit there going, wahaha, I stalk you now. But there's also, there is also a lot of people who just interact with people that way because they don't know any other way, and because, they're trying their best and it's not working, and they genuinely are sort of childishly frustrated that everything they're trying to connect with other people just isn't happening.
Yeah, like I say, he's sort of frustrated in that way. You're supposed to have some degree of sympathy for Travis, but you're not supposed to think, oh, he's this great guy who's kind of, you're supposed to find him sort of quite dislikable, and, you know, especially as the film goes on, he becomes more isolated and becomes more introverted and more of a creep. Starts to, you know, buy loads of guns and becomes very obsessed with guns and stuff. There's a terrifying scene when, you know, he's buying the guns and he's got an unloaded weapon that he's sort of trying out for weight and feel in this hotel room, and kind of points it out the window at a couple sitting on a bench and like starts firing, even though, you know, the gun's empty, but there's still something terrifying about him just staring down the barrel of a gun at a complete stranger and pulling the trigger.
Yeah. It's not really played as a twist, is it? I mean, he's quite a unsettling guy from the start. I mean, one of the first things we see him really doing once they've got into the narrative and established who he is sitting in his car for hours watching this woman while she works.
Yeah.
There's no attempt to like play it as he's just a guy flirting with this woman. Oh no, he's also stalking her. It's just, you're pretty much put in the position of he's like this from the start.
Yeah. Although there are lots of films where that sort of stuff is played like to end with a happy ending, you know, and there are lots of, you know, romantic comedies and stuff when it is like man through sheer force of persistence tricks woman into falling in love with him, and it is very creepy. Taxi Driver is overtly creepy, but you're not supposed to think that Travis is like kind of a good guy that you're rooting for to come through in the end. You're just supposed to like sort of cringe, you know, at his awfulness. The other thing about this film is that it is a brilliantly detailed portrait of New York at its lowest point in its history, pretty much. Everyone thinks of New York now from, you know, glitzy 80s and 90s romantic comedies, or like Marvel dramas, you know, like such as Luke Cage and Jessica Jones and Daredevil. They make New York look pretty good, right? We forget that New York did have this bit in the 1970s when it was terrible. Like, a lot of the middle class people moved out, so the tax base collapsed, and then the city became very poor and very crime-ridden. And this was kind of, film was made when New York was at its lowest ebb. So it is just filled with like drug dealers and prostitutes and, you know, gun runners, like Travis described as an open sewer. And New York was in a very bad way. There were, you know, murders committed openly on the street and stuff at the time. I mean, there's a bit when he's in a coffee shop talking to some other taxi drivers. It just sort of pans across the pimps who also sat there. You know, and it's like Harvey Keitel does a great performance in a few scenes as a particularly unpleasant pimp. Yeah, and it is a real, like, gritty portrait of how, you know, nasty and how low New York did sink in the 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, this is possibly a bit of a tangent as I'm basically critiquing something else. But yeah, I mean, the thing people say about Daredevil is it's slightly anachronistic. If it does want to be about this New York, in a way, you know, this sort of grimy, dirty New York, this sort of grimy, dirty Hell's Kitchen that it's meant to be set in. But realistically, Hell's Kitchen / New York isn't really like that anymore. And Daredevil therefore comes across as a bit weird and, again, anachronistic because it's sort of trying to evoke that. I think it's, in universe, there's a vague attempt to say that the incident in Avengers has caused this part of New York to plummet down the poverty ladder again.
But was Daredevil originally created in the 1970s?
It's one of these comic narrative things. The character was created in the 60s, but it became a sort of, I think the 70s, maybe 80s, is when it became a sort of crime comic and more focused on this sort of grimy, organised crime aspect of the comic universe because the creator Frank Miller took it over and that's his thing.
Yeah, but also I think the TV show has imported the sort of aesthetic and the dramas of the original comic, and the comic is probably, to some degree, contemporary with Taxi Driver.
Yeah, I think it is very much the TV show doing the comic, even though the comic is a bit anachronistic, which is, you know, something that Marvel have come up against in a lot of their stuff.
Yeah, and that's what New York was like at the time. And Taxi Driver is a good point of showing that, like, how seedy New York got. Epitomised by Jodie Foster, who won an Oscar for, I think, only about something like 14 minutes of screen time. She's not in that film very much, but she won an Oscar, and she does a great performance as, a child prostitute. It's very frightening in places and stuff, especially the scenes between her and Harvey Keitel as her pimp. But it is visceral and gritty and unpleasant, but very powerful as well. This is a compromising and difficult film, but I thought she is very good in this and deserves that Oscar she won.
Yeah, they're not giving us these sort of obvious, easy answers about Travis, are they? I mean, one would suspect there's probably a point about PTSD in there somewhere, but it's never made really explicit.
Yeah, the Vietnam is only mentioned right at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And this is a great way to start a film. Open your film with a guy going for a job interview, which means he gets to talk about himself and fill you in. But yeah, that's one time he's mentioned that he was a Marine, he was in Vietnam, and he can't sleep and stuff, so he's lacking structure and meaning in his life. I mean, he talks at various times about how he wants to find meaning and wants to find a higher purpose. However, for most of that film, his higher purpose is he wants to assassinate this politician who's running for president, and then fails to do that, so he instead shoots up a building full of pimps. What did you make of the ending? Like, after the shootout.
It was odd. Obviously, it successfully zags away from my expectations. I did actually go on the internet after I'd sat with it for a few minutes to see what, people thought of it. And I know there's some discussion back and forth about whether it's meant to be like his coma vision or if it's meant to be taken sincerely. And apparently Scorsese has weighed in to say it's meant to be taken relatively on face value.
Yeah, because I always interpreted it as... Because it goes from being such a dark film to having such a sweet ending, so sweet, positive ending. I always interpreted it as Travis lies dying and he's been shot in the neck, obviously, at that point. As he lies dying in the aftermath of the gunfight, he imagines basically everything will work out perfectly from this. And which is what you see. That was always my interpretation.
Yeah, as I say, the interpretation I've read, I think at least one of which was a quote from Scorsese or the writer. Paul Schrader, the writer, I think? Anyway. That was basically saying, it's meant to be this sort of vague, dark joke in which he's clearly an unsettling guy doing sort of disturbing things, but because people want that sort of easy narrative, he's been played as this hero. But the shot at the end and the general way it sort of reenacts the start of the film and sort of slightly odd look in his eye is meant to imply that he'll probably do something just as bad soon, and it'll probably go just as badly. I don't know. I mean, you are right. It does probably almost make more sense as a vision, because particularly the parts with Betsy, it's a bit sort of, things are just going weirdly well at this stage.
There's also the element that he cuts all his hair off before he attempts to do the assassination, and in the final scene, his hair is back to like it was before. So I don't know. I always read a lot into that. But
that is a very good point.
Could be over analysing.
Well, I don't remember if they said in the film how long he was meant to be in this coma. It's ambiguous, I guess that's the point. I will admit the idea that it's meant to be taken literally does require a bit of a stretch in a lot of ways. It depends how much of a sort of cynical worldview you want to assume. I
do take your interpretation, though, that it does actually ring true if this is kind of part of a cycle. And then we reach the beginning. At the end of the film, we reach the beginning of the cycle again, and Travis will go through this again, repeating everything, and probably again do something violent at the end of it. We don't know what he did in Vietnam. It's possible he went through the same cycle. I think that's an interesting interpretation of the film.
And not my interpretation, I must stress. But I think I may be quoting an interview with either the director or the writer. But yeah, I think that's one way of looking at it. There was definitely the slightly odd look in his eye at the very, very end, which is very much sort of, don't be distracted by the fact it's worked out well for him this time. He's still clearly a very disturbed guy.
Yeah.
But yes, no, I liked it. As I say, it sort of sat interestingly with me with the Garth Ennis Punisher comics. Ennis gets a lot of credit for doing a sort of a credible Punisher who could really exist. I think this, if anything, does an even better job of portraying, what that sort of guy would actually be like.
Yeah, I think they were feeding off a lot of the same impulses at the time.
Well, Vietnam, obviously, yeah.
Vietnam veterans, and a lot of Vietnam veterans did some very disturbing things. Like we discussed in the episode when we covered the BFI Film Festival, I saw the film Tower about that massacre at Austin University. Again, that was a Vietnam veteran who shot a lot of people. They were feeding off a zeitgeist, a cultural zeitgeist at the time. Yeah. Yes, they are related.
But no, it was a good film, and it's good to finally see a De Niro film from the peak of his career rather than the sort of latter-day comedy phase.
Yeah, I know he was in Bad Grandpa, which Mark Kermode, I think, said was one of the worst movies he'd ever sat through.
Possibly the only De Niro film I've ever seen is Meet the Parents, so this was better than that. Not that Meet the Parents is an awful comedy, but this is just a better film.
Yeah. You got some very good De Niro films, I'm sure, will be recommended soon. There are some other great ones, especially from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. He did some great films. So I can imagine there'll be another one in the near future.
Spoilers.
Okay, so this is the point when Nick would normally recommend something to me for the next episode. But next episode comes out just before Christmas. It will be the closest we get to a Christmas special. So we need to cover an absolute classic Christmas movie. We're not doing Miracle on 34th Street. We're not doing It's a Wonderful Life. We're doing the greatest Christmas film of all time. So for next episode, Nick, I'm recommending you watch Die Hard.
Yes, it's true, I haven't seen Die Hard. Until now. Although, obviously, the greatest Christmas film of all time is The Muppet Christmas Carol, but I'm willing to give Die Hard a chance.
Well, we'll find out what you thought in the next episode. That's all we have to say this time. If you enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please subscribe so that you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please leave us a review, as it helps other people find the show. If you like, you can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, or on Facebook, where you can search for Moderate Fantasy Violence.
And there's also our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com, which includes a few bits and pieces and deleted scenes and so on, as well as, of course, our episodes and links to where you can find them. And I should be putting my annual top 10 TV shows up on the MFV website at some point in the next month. I'm mostly just saying this at this point because I need to start thinking of what they are. And anyway, you can find more from me, including the last few years of top 10 TV shows, at nickbryan.com, as well as details of my self-published crime books. And you can follow me on Twitter at nickmb.
You can follow me on Twitter, where I'm at Alastair J.R. Ball. And also, you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. Thanks for listening to this episode. In the next one, we'll be covering Rogue One, a Star Wars story, something we're all very excited about. We'll also be looking at Birth of a Nation, covering the second series of The Man in the High Castle, and finding out what Nick thought of Die Hard. Well, thank you very much for listening. Have a great time.
Bye. And also, while we're doing random shout-outs, shout-out to the actor playing Ram, whose name I very consciously haven't looked up. I'll actually redo this bit once I've looked up the name.
It's a shame, because then we lose the your excellent turning of cunt into a verb. Probably leave that out.
Oh, it turns out Googling Ram class mostly just gives you information about random access memory.
It could have been a lot worse. You're ramming class.
It's not my fault he's named after a sheep. Give me a break.